1821. In a small village called Angers in the Jura region of France, a boy was born into a modest family. His name was Louis Vuitton. At the time, no one could have imagined that this boy's name would one day become a symbol of luxury, recognized around the world. He was not born into a wealthy family. There was no established business waiting for him. No one left him millions of dollars. Instead, his family had worked for generations in milling and woodworking. From an early age, Louis understood the nature of wood. He grew up watching how wood was shaped and worked. Although he lived a simple life, his interest in craftsmanship developed at an early age. But the most unexpected decision of Louis Vuitton's life was still ahead of him. He was only 14 years old. Most teenagers at that age remained close to their parents. But Louis chose a different path. He decided to go to Paris. And the most remarkable part was this: he walked there. For a 14-year-old boy, this was not simply a journey. He was leaving his home and heading alone toward an unknown future. According to the official Louis Vuitton history, he traveled roughly 400 kilometers to Paris on foot. The journey took about 2 years. During that time, he worked various ordinary jobs. He worked as a laborer. He worked around horses. He worked with wood. So when he eventually reached Paris, he was not a wealthy traveler. He arrived as a young man hardened by work. In 1837, when Louis reached Paris, he was around 16 years old, and an entirely different world opened before him. Paris, a huge city, thousands of people, new forms of transportation, wealthy travelers, carriages, ships, trains, and a profession that initially seemed ordinary, but would eventually change Louis Vuitton's entire life: packing and trunk making. At that time, people could not travel with modern wheeled suitcases like we do today. Travelers' clothing, books, personal belongings, and valuables were packed into special boxes and trunks. Arranging and protecting these belongings properly required great skill. Louis became an apprentice to a trunk maker named Romain Maréchal in Paris. He would spend the next 17 years of his life learning the craft. 17 years. That matters, because Louis Vuitton did not become a master overnight. He learned for years. He mastered working with wood. He learned how to protect people's belongings. He watched travelers carefully. He studied what they needed. And most importantly, he began to see their problems. Louis eventually realized something. As people traveled more, their needs were changing. The world was changing. Railways were expanding. Ships were developing. People were traveling more frequently than before. But many traditional trunks were not designed for this new era. Some trunks had rounded tops. They were difficult to stack, and protecting belongings from rain and the rough conditions of travel was a serious problem. Louis observed all of this, and one day he asked himself a simple question: why does it have to be this way? That question would help change the way people traveled. In 1854, Louis Vuitton was 33 years old. He opened his own shop at 4 Rue Neuve des Capucines in Paris. It was the first major step in the history of what would eventually become one of the world's most recognizable luxury names. But there were no modern handbags filling the store, no fashion runways, no perfumes, no expensive shoes. Louis Vuitton was first and foremost a maker of travel trunks. His main goal was not to display fashion. His goal was to protect people's belongings better. And this was where one of his greatest innovations appeared. Louis moved away from traditional, rounded top trunks and began making flat top trunks. It may seem like a simple change, but its advantages were enormous. Flat trunks could be stacked on top of one another. They were lighter, they were strong, and they were much more convenient for travel. Louis improved the wooden construction and introduced lightweight materials and specialized canvas. His trunks covered with Trianon gray canvas became practical and innovative products. And here's something interesting. Louis Vuitton was not originally trying to become a luxury fashion brand. He solved a real problem. He made travel easier for people. And many great brands begin exactly this way. People do not necessarily pay for something simply because it is fashionable. They pay because it provides a useful solution. By 1859, the Paris workshop had become too small for Louis Vuitton. He established a new workshop in Asnières-sur-Seine, near Paris. The location was not chosen by accident. It was close to Paris, and the Seine River made it convenient to transport the wood Louis needed. In other words, Louis Vuitton was thinking not only about craftsmanship, but also about logistics. He considered not only how his products were made, but also how the materials would reach the workshop. In 1867, a major international exhibition was held in Paris. Louis Vuitton presented his products there. He was no longer simply a craftsman. He was becoming an entrepreneur who could present his innovations to a wider audience. His trunks attracted the attention of wealthy travelers, and the Louis Vuitton name began spreading beyond Paris. But another major problem appeared: copying. As his designs became more popular, other manufacturers began reproducing them. Louis responded by creating new designs. In the 1870s, striped canvas designs were introduced. Later, in 1888, Georges Vuitton introduced the damier canvas design. The pattern included distinctive markings associated with Vuitton. But the copyists did not stop there. Around this time, Louis Vuitton's son, Georges Vuitton, became increasingly involved in the family business. Georges did not simply continue his father's business. He took it to a new level. In 1885, he opened the first Louis Vuitton store outside France in London. This marked the beginning of the brand's international expansion. But Georges still faced one major problem. If people continued copying Louis Vuitton products, how could the brand protect itself? It needed a new symbol. And in 1896, something was created that would eventually become one of the most recognizable visual symbols in the world: the LV monogram. In 1896, Georges Vuitton created the new monogram pattern in honor of his father. It featured intertwined L and V letters, along with floral and geometric motifs. One of its purposes was to create a distinctive design that could help distinguish Vuitton products from imitations. But no one knew that this pattern would become a globally recognized symbol more than a century later. Today, when people see the LV symbol, they immediately think of luxury. But its origins were not really about fashion. They began with a son trying to protect his father's legacy. After Louis Vuitton died, his family continued the business. The craftsmanship was passed from generation to generation. The trunks changed. The materials changed. The way people traveled changed. But one idea remained. Something created for travel should not only be beautiful, it should also be useful. That idea eventually became an important part of Louis Vuitton's identity. The company did not immediately become focused on clothing. It was first connected to travel itself. Trunks, bags, travel accessories, specially designed travel goods. That is why the history of Louis Vuitton should not be viewed only as fashion history. It is travel history. It is craftsmanship history. It is business history. And most importantly, it is the story of one man's decision to take a risk. Think about something interesting. When Louis Vuitton left for Paris at the age of 14, he did not have what we would call a brand today. He did not have millions in capital. He did not have a social media audience. He could not advertise himself online. There was only one thing he could do: work. He spent 2 years working different jobs during his journey. Then he spent 17 years learning one profession in Paris. Only after all those years did he open his own shop. So behind his success was not a one-day burst of motivation. It was decades of experience and persistence. He solved a real problem. He protected travelers' belongings. He made trunks lighter. He made them easier to stack. He improved the materials. He improved the locks. He protected the designs. And only then did the business continue to grow. In 1889, Georges Vuitton patented a multi-tumbler lock system designed to provide strong security. It was another example of the company's focus on functionality and protection. Today, when people hear the name Louis Vuitton, many immediately think of handbags. But the first product at the heart of this brand's history was not a handbag. It was a travel trunk. A simple trunk, once crafted by hand, eventually became part of the history of the global luxury industry. And the most fascinating part is this: the founder did not begin his life inside the world of luxury. He came from a small French village. At 14, he left home. He began walking toward Paris. For 2 years, he worked different jobs. He finally reached Paris. He became an apprentice. He spent 17 years learning the craft. At 33, he opened his first shop. Then he created his first major innovations. And eventually, his name began spreading around the world. Today, Louis Vuitton is one of the most recognizable names in the fashion and luxury world. But behind this enormous name was one simple idea. Can I make this better than it was before? Louis Vuitton kept asking himself that question. Make the trunk better. Improve the material. Make travel easier. Protect people's belongings. Create a distinctive design. Protect that design from copying. And continue improving with every generation. In 2026, the Louis Vuitton monogram celebrates its 130th anniversary. The symbol Georges Vuitton, created in 1896, has survived for more than a century. Once it was simply a new pattern. Today it is recognized around the world. So the history of Louis Vuitton is not really about expensive handbags. It is the story of a boy who left his home at the age of 14. A boy who walked hundreds of kilometers toward an unknown future. A young man who spent 17 years learning one craft. A craftsman who turned an idea into a business. A son who continued his father's work. A family that fought against imitation and created a distinctive monogram. And most importantly, the story of a person who came from a small village and eventually created a name known throughout the world. When Louis Vuitton left for Paris at the age of 14, no one knew what was waiting for him. But at the end of that long journey, he did more than simply reach Paris. He changed the course of his life. And his name, Louis Vuitton, went from being the name of one young man to becoming the name of a global brand.